This episode of Infinite Scroll is brought to you by Bumble. As part of Bumble's ongoing mission to create a dating space where everyone feels safe, they've teamed up with safety advocate Tarang Chawla to launch a new suite of safety features and a social content series aimed at improving dating culture here in Australia. Bumble's latest updates are designed to empower its community and foster safer, more respectful connections, like the feature Share Date, which allows you to share your date details with a trusted contact, and ID verification, which adds an extra layer of trust by letting members confirm their identity. Plus, Bumble's Review Before You Send feature now extends to chat conversations, allowing its community to reflect on their messages and make sure they're being respectful before sending them. Thank you to Bumble for making this episode possible. Hi everyone, welcome back to Infinite Scroll. I haven't recorded an Infinite Scroll episode in a couple of weeks. It feels good to be back. So, as you guys can probably tell from the title of this episode, I am so excited because this episode is going to be a deep dive into the Manosphere, and I'm doing it alongside Tarang Chawla. This is less of an interview and more of a collaborative episode, so I hope you guys like it. As always, we poured a lot of time and energy into putting this episode together for you guys, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear it. This is a very heavy but a very important topic. As always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Please sign up to our newsletter, also called Infinite Scroll, where on Fridays we round up the 5 biggest think pieces from that week. And we are trying to get to 10,000 YouTube subscribers. We are so close. We are like just a few subscribers off. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you guys haven't already. All right, I hope you guys like this episode. From shows like Adolescents to various alpha male podcasters, what once was a fringe online space is becoming increasingly mainstream. Enter the Manosphere. The Manosphere is a term people use to describe a specific side of the internet, a collection of websites, forums, blogs, and other types of content that completely oppose feminism. As you can probably imagine, this side of the internet is vast, and much of it can be quite triggering, upsetting, and disturbing. With that in mind, please be aware that we'll be discussing topics around violence, toxic masculinity, and misogyny. Listener discretion is advised. That being said, I actually have a guest here today to help me break down the rise of the Manosphere, its niches, and how it's impacting Gen Z, with a specific focus on dating culture. Welcome, Tarang Chawla.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to chat with you. I've been following your work for years. For anyone who is not familiar with Tarang, he is an award-winning speaker, writer, and advocate. He is the co-founder of Not One More Nikki, a grassroots nonprofit working to end men's violence. Adding to his already impressive resume is a sessional academic at Monash University, and he is a former Young Australian of the Year finalist. Tarang has also recently been announced as Bumble Australia's safety advocate and will be offering support on policies and features to make online dating safer. So before we get into the episode, could you tell our listeners a little bit more about Not One More Nikki and your work in this space?
Of course. Firstly, thanks for having me on. It's such a treat to be here and to be able to have this conversation, for your listeners about a pretty full-on topic, one that a lot of your listeners, I suppose, live with the consequences of, and then hopefully talk a little bit about not only the work that Bumble's doing, but I guess the responsibility that all men play when it comes to challenging the manosphere and this idea that just because of the way things are changing, it doesn't mean that men are under attack as a whole, but really it's an opportunity for growth and reflection and a little bit of positive self-development for men as well, I think. So I started Not One More Nikki following the murder of my younger sister, Nikki. My sister was 23 when she was killed after she rejected a man and he couldn't take no. And his attitude was that if she's not going to be with me, if I can't be with her, then no one else can. And, we've seen sort of this devastating rise of this type of men's violence, particularly around dating and safety for women in Australia. And it's really challenging as a man who wants all women to be able to be free and safe and equal in all relationships, professional ones, romantic ones especially, to see this kind of thing going on. And so the work that we do at Not One More Nikki pushes for kind of what you might call systemic reform at a structural level, so working across policy, advocacy and education, with a big focus on primary prevention. So how do we change the sorts of attitudes and drivers that lead to that type of really full-on violence? Like, how do we address the things that might seem innocent or innocuous, things that we might talk about today, like negging, for example? Like, how does that relate to really, really serious, terrifying things? And so for me, it's really, really important, I think, to have these sorts of new features from Bumble and to have this kind of accountability from a dating app, from a global dating app that's saying, we want women to feel safe on our app. We want women to have experiences that are positive, because getting to meet someone new should be exciting. You should have butterflies in your stomach because you're thinking about the possibility of what could be. You're not getting fearful because you're worried about your physical safety. And unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of women. So Not One More Nikki sort of works across the board to address that type of thing.
Okay, so we have spoken about the Manosphere at length on this podcast, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, but we've never actually done a completely dedicated episode on this topic. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, the online manosphere is a dark side to the internet. It is widely understood as an umbrella term for the men's rights movement, capitalizing on the quote-unquote gripes that many men have with gender equality and the feminist movement at large. Though this is a blanket statement, the users who operate in the manosphere typically have a unifying ideology, believing that men, particularly white men, are actually the victims of contemporary gender relations. At its core, many manosphere participants and men's rights activists see feminism as an obstacle to actualizing their destiny of enforcing patriarchal gender roles. As Denise Kennedy Collar puts it in her book, Extremism and Radicalization in the Manosphere, quote, "The manosphere attracts disaffected, lonely, isolated, and unhappy young men. For many, it radicalizes their despair into anger and hatred and gives them an outside target on which to blame all their problems while celebrating aggressive masculinity." The ideological origins of the manosphere can be traced back to the 1970s men's liberation movement. This, of course, was a response, or should I say a spin-off, to the women's liberation movement of the same decade. However, the term manosphere itself goes back to 2009, first appearing on a Blogspot post to describe the various communities catering to men's interests online. The term was popularized years later when a man named Ian Ironwood, who was a pornography marketer, self-published a book called The Manosphere: A New Hope for Masculinity. Since then, journalists, podcasters, and commentators have used the term to describe this space. It has also become synonymous with violence, with many journalists pointing to the manosphere as one of the drivers of various mass shootings in the United States. Okay, so before we dive too deep, Tarang, I'm curious how familiar you are with the manosphere and alpha male culture online. When and how were you introduced to this side of the internet?
I suppose, like any man, I'm very familiar with it, right? I'm intimately familiar with it. Part of it is the fact that it relates to a lot of my work. So I take sort of that kind of forensic interest in it, I guess you'd call it. But the other side of it is that as men on the internet, regardless of age, it's so easy to see this content, right? To be exposed to it. And I think for me, I've really witnessed and experienced how this online misogyny is fueling real world violence, right? Not to say that what's happening online is okay. There's a lot of people that think that, just because it's something written in a comment section, that it doesn't have genuine impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. That's not the case, right? A lot of the harmful stuff that's said online has pretty devastating consequences for women and girls in particular. And so there's this whole thing, where it's all of this kind of radicalization under the guise of self-help. And so I think one of the things that I've seen and one of the things that I've sort of become so familiar with is how, whether it's Reddit forums or like just going on my own YouTube spiral, seeing how quickly I can go from, setting up an app for the first time, whether it's TikTok or another app, and then seeing how you go from like just generic, bland, vanilla content into stuff that is condoning rape or deep-seated misogyny and violence against women, you know? And there's so many influencers online. I don't want to name drop them because I don't want them to get credit for what they do, right? But we know who these people are, and they're propagating views online. They're spreading messages online that are, I think, really, really harmful to women. But at the same time, I think that they really limit men. You know, I think what I really care about with this is the idea that self-help for men is a bad thing is something that I disagree with. I think that content that helps men better themselves is fantastic. What I worry about, you know, and when I've paid more attention to what content men are consuming, I've worried about how a lot of that stuff is the kind of gateway. It's like the gateway drug to more serious stuff. So it might start with like fitness content, right? And that's great. Like if you want to look after yourself, fantastic. But it quickly devolves into this kind of misogyny and hatred of women and blaming women for the issues that men face. And that's something that I just fundamentally disagree with. And I think that, you know, more men would do a lot better in their life and have better outcomes if they were a bit more conscious about this type of content that, you know, they're exposed to.
And I guess going back to self-help content, I'm curious to hear what type of content then you think men should be consuming, or if there is any kind of safe, quote unquote, self-help content for men that won't lead them down a pipeline.
I mean, there's a bunch of like, you know, really good mental health podcasts that are anchored by men, or at least co-anchored by men. And I think one of the things that they do well is that they are pro-feminist and pro-social. So rather than blaming a particular group, whether it's women or immigrants or people of color or trans folk, rather than using a marginalized group as a scapegoat, they really get to the core of what is the anxiety or what is the fear or the apprehension that men are experiencing. And I think that's sort of what we might call positive masculinity. That's under that umbrella. And I think it's really powerful because that type of content and being more selective as men about the content that you consume really helps challenge the manosphere, which has just become so powerful.
So the manosphere isn't unique to the United States. It's international. The anti-feminist ideology extends beyond country, culture, and religion, showing just how powerful this kind of rhetoric and community can be. That being said, theorizing the manosphere is tough, but various experts have tried. A journal article by Debbie Ging, a senior lecturer from Dublin City University, investigates the masculinities and anti-feminist sentiments that have emerged across the manosphere. Among her findings, she concludes that anti-feminist politics of the manosphere are rooted in extreme misogyny and personal attacks directed towards specific women, most of whom are publicly feminist. One of the most mainstream examples of this phenomenon is, of course, Gamergate, which we will get into later. As Ging notes, quote, the findings indicate a marked shift from a predominantly political to a broadly cultural discourse, including a move toward a more visual, video, and meme-based articulations of men's rights. This is accompanied by a greater preoccupation with men's personal relationships and psychological and emotional pain rather than the collective political action. Other academics have pointed to the phenomenon of aggrieved entitlement to explain why men are drawn to the manosphere and men's rights activist groups. To put it simply, aggrieved entitlement is a feeling of being owed certain privileges and a lifestyle, and is often associated with cis, straight, white men. And to many of these men, feminism and women's rights pose a threat to the life they were quote-unquote promised. Quote, as the saying goes, when one is accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. In the manosphere, feminism has been conflated with female superiority or the destruction of masculine. Kennedy Collar continues in her book. At the heart of the manosphere's anti-feminist misogyny is an insecurity about where they would find themselves in the social order if basic notions of masculinity were culturally redefined. From your point of view, Tarang, what kinds of men are most vulnerable to being radicalized?
Oh, what a great question, Lauren. I think, you know, we kind of, in order to understand that, we have to get back to, I guess, some of that stuff that you were saying that, you know, in quoting Kennedy Collar there about what makes the manosphere so powerful. And I think at its core, the types of men that get invested in the messaging of the manosphere and sometimes fall prey to it without necessarily realizing it are the ones who are like directionless. you know, ones who might be struggling with their own self-esteem, their kind of identity. And I think if we look at it, like if we take like this big picture view, like we step back for a second, there's been like post-second wave feminism, so many like advances for women, right, globally, and obviously so much more that needs to be done, particularly with like an intersectional lens and accounting for like the varying kind of experiences that different types of women have across the world. But I think what has happened is that you have this kind of thing now where struggling men get this like identity, right? They get this sense that instead of feeling disconnected, emasculated, and directionless, they latch onto these content creators or these influencers, and ultimately they feel like they now belong somewhere, right? And I think one of the things that's really powerful there is that the Manosphere has sort of almost like the algorithm is rewarding controversy, which gets clicks, right? And so I'm sure you experience this. I'm sure listeners who themselves are like content creators will find that like they'll put stuff out on socials and no one will engage with it. And they do something more controversial, or they say something that's a bit more like clickbaity, and all of a sudden it just like it's their most watched video that they've ever made. And they're kind of a bit shocked themselves. They're like, hang on a minute, like what's going on here? And what's going on is that this is by design, right? It's by design that content that discriminates against marginalized groups, women as a whole, right? Not to mention like particular subgroups of women, will end up performing better, right? The algorithm is rewarding that. And I think that on the counter, like the flip side of that has been that places for men where they can sort of express vulnerability, where they can express anxiety or fear without being shamed, are so few and far between, both in the real world and especially online. And so you find this thing where, like particularly in my work with young men, they often don't want to go along with what they know is openly sexist or misogynistic, but in order to fit in, they'll kind of, the kind of belief that they need to belong to a community of men will trump whatever like kind of moral values they were raised in their family home, or the things they learn at school or at TAFE or university or whatever. And I think it's really important, you know, if we're trying to address this, that we get to the core of what types of men are vulnerable to radicalization. And the common thread is that they are sort of men that are A, searching for belonging, and B, searching for someone to blame. And I think that's the really powerful thing. It's men who are open to blaming women or the feminist movement at large without even really understanding what the feminist movement is, because the feminist movement isn't about women's superiority at all, right? It's about women's equality, right? And really about liberating men as well from gender stereotypes that limit their own development, right? It's about creating spaces where men can express themselves freely. And I think, you know, the Manosphere has become so powerful because it's given these men an identity, although it's, like you touched on before, it's built on grievance and hate. And I think that's ultimately so counter to what we want boys to have, which is role models for emotional literacy, role models for their own well-being, role models for actually having fulfilling like experiences on dating apps, right? But unfortunately, a lot of those kind of grifters, you know, that are toxic male influencers aren't giving them that in reality.
It's clear that questions of power and the potential of losing it propel the manosphere forward, as we just mentioned. To many of us, it is obvious that men continue to hold positions of power across the board. You only need to look so far at the gender gaps in political leadership and senior positions in the workplace. But participants of the manosphere would say otherwise. So it's worth questioning why these men feel threatened in such a way that pushes them to anti-feminism and extreme misogyny. To answer this, we need to understand what these sub-niches value. Groups within the manosphere tend to define a person according to their sexual market value, SMV, or their level of sexual desirability, both for men and women. And for low-status men, those who are seen as less desirable or aren't having sex, this often feeds into their sense of aggrieved entitlement. So, Tarang, what role do you think loneliness and isolation play in pulling men toward these spaces?
Oh, it's a huge factor, right? There's this stat that like 75% of people want to feel less lonely. And on the face of it, right, you can just look at that as being numbers, right? But that's really 3 in 4 people that want to feel less lonely. So to me, that's kind of like almost a cry for connection. And I think one of the things that happens here for men who are drawn into the manosphere is that loneliness makes men susceptible to spaces that offer quick answers, right? I think that like actually doing the work is pretty confronting. And it's also not very sexy. You know, like for men, the act of like going to therapy or taking up a boxing class as a way to like healthily deal with like whatever aggression or anger you're feeling, it requires putting in the work. And I think it's so much easier to kind of look for a scapegoat. And that's where a lot of these men get radicalized without realizing it. And I think that's why it's become such a big social problem, is because it starts so innocently. And I think one of the things, you know, like Bumble's, you know, feature about being able to share the date, I think it helps to like build trust, right? Because it's kind of going in at a level where men are kind of encouraged to be accountable from the beginning, right? And it's kind of also addressing the problem head on, that a lot of women in particular, when they're going on dates, when they're meeting men for the first time or even for the second or third time, are not, you know, necessarily as safe as they could or they should be. And I think that it's really important that we kind of understand that, yes, men are feeling lonely, but loneliness is not an excuse or a justification. It's only an explanation for how they get radicalized, right? So I think we have to like kind of juggle that kind of competing truth where it's like a lot of men are using it as an excuse. And you touched on that idea of like aggrieved entitlement and being owed something. And I think, you know, for the male listeners or for those listening who have men in their lives, I'd encourage them to listen to this segment of the show and kind of reflect on the fact that women don't owe them anything. You know, like Ronnie Cheng, the comedian, has this amazing bit where he talks about how women aren't vending machines for men. Right? Where it's just like, just because a lot of men will be like, I bought her dinner, you know, or I paid for this. And it's like, well, they don't owe you sex, but it's because they're so ingrained in this, right? And a lot of these toxic male influences play directly into that idea that the world has changed and you're the victim now, right? And actually, that's not what's happening. The world has changed to give people more rights. And you said it before that, you know, for those with privilege, equality can feel like oppression. And that's what's happening here. A lot of men are feeling like they're lonely and victims and no one wants to date them and that they are like they're doomed. But that's not the case. The actual flip side of this is that there's so much opportunity for men. And I think loneliness kind of is one of the ways that some of those manosphere influences really play into the vulnerabilities and insecurities that men have and sadly are going through very alone, you know? And I think one of the antidotes is for men to be more open to talking about this stuff and actually sit in the discomfort of it.
Absolutely. So before we get into why the manosphere has become increasingly mainstream and what that means for both men and women, it's important to break down some of the most prominent subcultures that exist within it. Understanding these groups helps clarify the underlying beliefs that drive the movement. One umbrella idea within the manosphere is the concept of being red-pilled. With the terminology coming from the Matrix, being quote-unquote red-pilled is being aware of the alleged truth of the world, which includes waking up to feminist brainwashing and misandry. Tarang, do you think it's enough for men to simply avoid red-pilled content, or how do you think men can be more proactive in calling it out when they see it? Or do you think men even realize that they are shown red-pilled content?
I think it depends, right? I think in some cases, you know, and we're talking about, particularly after like the success of adolescence on Netflix, we're having these conversations around just how people at a very young age are being radicalized. And I think in those situations, you know, just from like a children's development perspective, we're talking about kids here, right? So they're not necessarily going to have the same response as someone that's like 22, okay? And so for a lot of them, they may not even be aware that they're being red-pilled, right? But for those that are old enough and have enough life experience, I think often they are aware, right? And it starts, as we were saying, pretty innocuous. And I think what ends up happening is that those who don't want it to continue, just avoid it. The problem is that avoiding it isn't enough. Like, it still exists, it's still there. I think silence allows it to spread. Because at the, you know, the top of the show, when we were talking about how the algorithm rewards controversy, this is the type of content that gets so many more views, so many more clicks, and it gets shared so much. And I think one of the things for men is that we're often worried that calling things out means confrontation. Calling things out means that you have to take this kind of moral high ground. And I don't think that's what calling things out actually is. I think calling things out happens best when you don't do it in a confrontational way. You know, I think you can do things by sharing better content, right? So for men, rather than getting that kind of video and sharing it that you know is kind of goes against your own moral values. Share the content that uplifts men, that shows positive examples of men doing really great things, whether that's for men themselves or for women or for other people. And that content does exist. It's there online. And I think that's a really powerful thing. I think another thing that can be really powerful is checking on your friends. You know, particularly if you're a guy who kind of sees that someone is going through like this kind of mental health thing, or they've recently been through a breakup, understanding that these are the risk factors where men get drawn into manosphere content, right? When they go through a breakup, they're feeling at their lowest. We've all been through breakups. It's when you feel like, okay, nobody loves me. Not true, right? But when you're in the dumps, right, and you're really, really depressed, a lot of these influencers will capitalize on that. They'll reach out to them in a way where it's like, hey, like I'm here and this is how you get better, this is how you get the girl, etc. And I think one of the things that makes me really uncomfortable is that we have to give men more opportunities to express themselves when they are in that situation without shame, right? So that men can feel vulnerable openly. And I think also there is like one of the most powerful things that I've found is not laughing along at jokes in, say, group chats, not actually going with the kind of stuff that denigrates women or marginalized groups, right? Something so powerful, which is so easy to do, is when someone makes a sexist joke, ask them to explain it. Just be like, wait, I don't get it. Like, what do you mean? And it's amazing how much stuff, right? How many reels we share on Insta, or how much stuff on TikTok just ends up being not that funny, right? And this isn't saying that you can't joke about topics, right? It's saying that you have to, that if you're a content creator or a comedian or a budding comedian, you have to be better than just punching down. And I think, I found it so powerful just asking people to explain, like, I don't get it. Because then they themselves, as they're explaining it, are almost telling on themselves, and they're like, wait, that's a bit awkward.
Yeah.
Right?
That flips the embarrassment, I guess.
And that doesn't involve like talking about feminism or misogyny or misogyny. You don't have to say any of those words. You just end up having the conversation without having the conversation, which I think is, still as powerful, right? In terms of the outcome that we seek. Like, I'd love it if we could be in a world where it's like we could just sit down with, two men could sit down and have an open conversation around feminism or mental health or feelings. But the reality is we're not there yet.
Yeah.
And we're not there yet because for a long time men have been shackled by these kinds of rigid expectations of masculinity. And so kind of doing those things helps to not only avoid red pill content, but actually to put it in its place.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, men's rights activists have, quote unquote, taken the red pill, but another prominent group that have been red pilled are incels. Incels are probably the most widely recognized subculture within the manosphere. We have spoken about this group before, but as a quick reminder, an incel is a portmanteau that stands for involuntary celibate. Like other groups within the manosphere, incels operate from a worldview rooted in patriarchy, gender roles, and eugenics. They believe that they are owed sex, seeing women as gatekeepers to something they believe is their right. This perceived sexual rejection fuels resentment, not just toward women, but also toward so-called chads, attractive, sexually successful men. While incels were once relegated to obscure blogs and forums, they have increasingly found online community through mainstream platforms. And even though this group has been condemned and repeatedly banned for its misogynistic and dangerous rhetoric, spaces like Reddit and now X have become new avenues for this ideology to spread, helping bring it closer to the mainstream. Another prominent group within the manosphere, and the last one that we'll discuss here, are pickup artists. These men rely on a set of strategies and psychological tricks specifically designed to manipulate women into sleeping with them. Much of this ideology is rooted in Neil Strauss's book, The Game, which essentially offers a playbook on how to quote-unquote win women through manipulation rather than genuine connection. One of the most well-known tactics in this space, as Tarang already mentioned, is negging, deliberately offering backhanded compliments to create insecurity in a woman, making her more likely to seek validation. Pickup artists also teach men to, quote, flip the script, encouraging them to create a dynamic where the woman is trying to gain the man's approval. This behavior is undeniably predatory, built on power imbalances and coercion rather than mutual respect or attraction. What's especially telling is that many men who identify as pickup artists often struggle with romantic success, and instead of reflecting on themselves, turn to formulas and manipulation to gain control. So, Tarang, what kind of relationship dynamics are being encouraged when men are taught to neg or manipulate women for validation?
I think at its core, it's kind of creating this dynamic, this like relationship dynamic that's built on power or control, not partnership. Right? That's really what we're getting at here. It's like the man is in charge and the woman is secondary to that. And I think it's also like teaching men to fear women's agency rather than respect it, which is this kind of really weird dynamic, right? Because a lot of this behavior from those who will use negging is driven by fear and insecurity, right? Like everything that we've learned so far in this episode about the manosphere is that it's not driven from like men are great, but we want them to be better than they are because there's some issues, right? It's that like women owe something to men are hard done by, men have been shortchanged, everybody hates us, no one wants to date us, etc. And that stuff isn't true. You know, and I think one of the things that really stands out for me in this conversation when it comes to negging and manipulation, well, I guess there's two things. One is I just want to preface that I'm not saying, and I don't think that this is only something that men do, right? There are other people, women, who might use these sorts of tactics. They might have even read the game. I'm a millennial, so I remember when it was like all over the news and everyone was like almost encouraged to read it. And it was kind of like almost sold to men. I remember when I was younger, it was like sold to men as being like the solution or the antidote to their problems. And I think at the time, for me, it was really difficult not to like kind of be red-pilled because I was just like, wait, like I'm not dating anyone. Is this why? And it's not why I was single at the time, right? It's got nothing to do with that. And so that's the first thing. And the second is that, like, you know, 96% of people that Bumble interviewed, they want more respectful experiences, right? So there's this kind of hunger for healthier norms and relationship behaviors as well. And I think that the dynamics from negging and manipulation are that you're setting yourself up. If you're a guy who's like trying to use these tactics, you're ultimately setting yourself up for a relationship that won't last the test of time, right? You're not setting yourself up for a healthy partnership. You're setting yourself up for failure. And it might not happen straight away, but it will happen eventually because no woman anywhere is going to want to be with a guy who's just consistently treating her like shit, right? And I'm not talking about like playful teasing and banter. I'm talking about like constantly putting someone down as a way to kind of keep them under the thumb, right? To kind of exert control over them. And I think one of the things that like these pickup artists are doing here is that they're kind of like, they're playing into that vulnerability that men have in a way where they're almost teaching men to like rehearse scripts rather than being their authentic self, right? And I think, you know, and I can never speak for women, but I think that all the women that I've ever met want men to be more authentic, right? They want men to connect with them. They want connection over performance, right? And a lot of the stuff that's in like the game and other strategies for picking up and like from pickup artists generally is kind of like grounded in this idea that men are like deficient and they need to follow this script, right? And so it kind of limits women, but it also limits men and makes them almost like they're a bit dumb or stupid and that, you know, their own charm or their own authenticity is not what's going to work for them. And I think it's really, really great to see kind of this shift in Gen Z. Right? If there's one thing I think Gen Z is doing really amazing, 79% of Gen Z people that Bumble interviewed would say that like self-love is foundational. So for me, I'm pretty optimistic. I think there's hope, right? That kind of younger users of the app and younger people in the dating scene kind of value that idea of like self-love and self-development that's actually better for everyone. And I think that's really powerful to me because I think all of those kinds of dating app coaches and all that, ultimately the majority of them are just teaching you a script. And that's not what a real relationship looks like. That's not what real connection in the long term looks like. It might get you the first date, it might set you up for the second, but that's it, right? And you know, most men don't aspire just to be fuckboys. And so I think what's really, really powerful is that actually like leaning into the vulnerability, actually leaning into the fear, and having these kinds of experiences that are grounded in authenticity and connection, and the uncomfortable fact of like dating is messy but also fun, right? And I think that's what's really powerful here, and we're kind of seeing that come through. And I think it's like we're living in this really interesting time now where I think more men are open to this conversation. And for men who are listening who are a bit worried, like, I'm going to be judged, yeah, you might be, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend and tell you that like people aren't going to judge you or think it's weird or maybe even call you slurs. But the reality is that there are enough people now that actually want to see the flip side, especially women. So if you're like a guy who like exclusively only dates women, then like it's probably better for you to lean into the authentic side of yourself that's a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit fearful, that sometimes cries, at the same scene in a movie or whatever. And just lean into that, because I think you'll actually have probably better dating prospects and results if you actually just embrace that side of yourself more.
So while the Manosphere is diverse, spanning across multiple platforms, forums, and creators, its members are ultimately united by a shared red-pilled ideology. At its core, the Manosphere promotes male supremacy, a shared sense of victimhood, and a tendency to blame women for changes in society that allegedly prioritize female empowerment. Despite their different approaches, they all feed into the same key belief, that feminism, equality, and women's success comes at the cost of men's power. After defining the Manosphere and exploring some of its niches, it's not surprising that this corner of the internet and the ideology that comes with it started as a fringe movement. But what was once seen as extreme is becoming increasingly mainstream. We talk a lot about the broader shift toward conservatism online, from the rise of trad wives to aesthetics like quiet luxury, clean girl, and old money, all of which subtly or not so subtly lean into the conservative values and the celebration of wealth. This shift obviously poses significant threats to women and other people who are not cis, white, and straight. And while these aesthetic trends are harmful, none pose as great a threat as the Manosphere's move into the mainstream. Before I dive into some theories, Tarang, do you want to share any theories that you have as to why the Manosphere has gone mainstream?
Yeah, I think it's because masculinity is in a state of flux. I think that masculinity isn't what it kind of used to be, like traditional masculinity. And so I guess influencers have stepped in where institutions have failed, right? There used to be kind of common rites of passage that boys and men kind of underwent that was like how they experienced what becoming a man was and what being a man meant. And a lot of that stuff now doesn't exist in the way that it used to. And I think that's largely for the better, right? I think a lot of the ways that boys were taught to be men in the past were rooted in kind of sexism or misogyny. And now, unfortunately, not only is that still the case, in some segments, it's grown to become more violent, more possessive, and more entitled than ever before. Right? And I think that one of the reasons that the Manosphere has gone mainstream is that these kinds of new methods, where pop culture is full of these figures, is that it's normalized views of men's entitlement over women's bodies, their choices, their experiences. And so we've seen it like in terms of legislation, like when we saw the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States, we saw like how laws were changing. And so now when institutions have failed women and men feel emboldened, right? We're seeing that there are men who are like grifters capitalizing on this, and they're making so much money. And I wish that our younger male listeners understood that a lot of these people don't actually really care about you or your well-being. They just see someone that they can make money from, and that's the most depressing thing, because they don't actually really care about you. They don't want you to get the girl. They don't want you to have the lifestyle. They don't want you to look old money, right?
Yeah.
They just want you to buy whatever it is that they're selling. And I think that's such a depressing thought and depressing reality. And so now they're offering this sense of identity and direction, and it's just wrapped up in misogyny. And one of the kind of best quotes that I was ever told about this stuff is that how there are generations of men, now when we hear about men shifting towards the right, like younger men, and going towards this idea of like wanting the trad wife aesthetic from their female partners and stuff, is that the kind of younger generation of men have the same misogyny and sexism of previous generations, but none of the life skills. So like they can punch a hole in drywall, but they don't know how to plaster it up and fix it.
That's really funny.
And I thought that was kind of really like, almost like telling on themselves.
Yeah.
Like they don't actually know how to do stuff that traditional men knew how to do. And so for those men who are kind of really, deep into that red pill ideology, it's almost like, bro, like check yourself. Like actually do a stock take of going, what's actually going well for me? And is it because all women suck and women are to blame and, feminists are evil? And if they're really honest, the answer is no. The answer is never that women are to blame or that feminism is equal. The answer is that there's a handful of content creators that they probably started following online because they thought that they'd help them in some way. And maybe they did at first, right? Maybe they did. But now all they're interested in is that they continue paying for that subscription, or that they continue basically sharing their content so more vulnerable men see it. So rather than actually helping men, they're setting them back.
So there are a couple of central moments that have propelled the manosphere into normalcy over the last few years. First and foremost is Gamergate. This was a massive harassment campaign in 2014 that targeted women who spoke out against misogyny in gaming. It all started when indie game developer Zoe Quinn released a game called Depression Quest. Soon after, an ex-boyfriend of Zoe's posted a lengthy, invasive blog accusing her of cheating with several men in the gaming industry, reportedly to boost her career. One of those men was allegedly a writer for Kotaku, a major gaming publication, named Nathan. Although both Zoe and Nathan denied the allegations, waves of gamers swarmed Twitter, Reddit, and 4chan, claiming that this was a, quote, ethical breach in gaming journalism. While the Gamergaters claimed they were fighting to expose corruption by any means necessary, their actions were ultimately pure harassment. Women faced relentless abuse and threats, some so severe that the FBI got involved. One of the women, aside from Zoe, who faced this abuse, a commentator named Anita Sarkeesian, became a subject of a video game where people could beat her up. Ultimately, the unchecked misogyny and pure violence of Gamergaters marked one of the first major collective hate campaigns against women coming from today's manosphere. Not only did these participants position their agenda through the mantle of victimhood and morality, but it was also a clear shift toward personalized attacks on women, a characteristic that's deeply embedded in the manosphere, as we have already touched on. Establishing a kind of ethical and moral superiority has gone a long way in normalizing the manosphere. This sense of victimhood, a mentality that wrongfully took off after the Me Too movement, is an extremely powerful form of collective identity. It can offer a sense of community, an explanation or excuse for why things may be bad, or even a scapegoat. Victimhood is a rallying emotion, an easy way to get people on board with a cause. And when it comes to the manosphere, this is exactly what has permitted its expansion. And this attitude, of course, reflects society and politics on a more macro level. That brings us to another reason why the manosphere has gone mainstream: the rise of people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk in positions of power. Here, there are two broad factors about Trump that have normalized the manosphere. The first is that Trump is a man that has been held liable for sexual assault and said some pretty disgusting things about women. Unfortunately, this hasn't proven to be an obstacle on his pursuit of the US presidency. Instead, it only validated many of the manosphere's beliefs. Trump's public persona has led many men to see his ascendancy as an opportunity to effectively push back against feminism, now that a quote-unquote real man is in the White House. But the second and often overlooked factor is Trump's populist bent. Populism is generally understood as an ideology that attaches itself to other political movements and beliefs. At the core of populism, though, is a feeling of victimhood, that the elites are ripping the people off. By feeding into populist rhetoric, Trump has successfully shown the power of victimhood as an identity definer, validating the manosphere's tendencies. Tarang, when misogyny gets wrapped up in this sense of victimhood and identity and content that is constantly pushed out online, which we have talked about a little bit so far, do you think it can be undone, or how can it be undone?
Yeah, I think it can. I think it can. And I don't say that because I'm just, wildly optimistic and living in some fantasy land, right? I think it can be undone, but that comes with some caveats, right? It comes with some cautions. It takes time and it takes real effort. And I think one of the ways that we get there is that men need unlearning and then relearning, not just shaming. You know, and from my perspective, I think that's why I try to advocate rather than just say criticize. You know, like you will never see me on social media saying that all men are bad or that all men are evil. I'll only ever say that I think all men play a role in the culture that might normalize violence against women, right? Because whether all men are violent or not, which we know they're not, all men benefit from men's kind of violence in the way that women are fearful, whether it's in public spaces or when they're in dating situations. And so I think it feels like this kind of mountain that we can't climb. It feels insurmountable. And I think one of the reasons is that for a long time, it's been on women's shoulders to kind of bring about this change. But I think it can change. Right? And one example that I think is really important is that culture can change. If we look at how we talk about mental health now, we'll see just how much the culture has shifted, right? There used to be this idea that if you had depression or anxiety, that you just get over it. But now we talk about it so much more differently. And it's not fixed, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we don't have way more work to do when it comes to mental health and mental illness. But we're talking about it in a way that is far less victim-blamey than it was before. And I think when it comes to, you know, this idea of misogyny that's wrapped up in victimhood and incels and the manosphere more broadly, culture can change, but it's going to take time and real effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of this, coupled with the way that women's rights have progressively been stripped back over the past decade, all of that has really emboldened the manosphere. And as a result, this side of the internet has become more palatable to the masses. Though a lot of what we've spoken about is unfolding in the United States, we can't overlook the implications for us here in Australia. As we've already discussed, the online world, and the manosphere specifically, is a transnational space. That means trends, ideologies, and the movements gaining traction overseas can easily bleed into our own digital landscape. So, Tarang, how do you think that Australia fits into the broader picture of the manosphere? And are we seeing a mirroring of international trends or something more homegrown?
I think that we in Australia, right, mirror the US and UK trends, definitely. But I think we also add some of our own that isn't as, particularly in the US, as visible. And that's that idea of, I guess, larrikinism, you know, or like the Aussie bloke who's always having banter. And I think that's something that plays out in Australia. And often the kinds of critics of equality or feminism or, you know, issues relating to gender equality often talk about how, oh, you can't be a bloke anymore, you can't have banter. And so I think that one of the things that Australia does that's unique is that we use that as a gateway to casual sexism, to normalize the denigration or putting down of women, right? And I think that's sort of one of the things that sets Australia apart in a harmful way from, say, the US or the UK. We also have homegrown influences here too. You know, we have a lot of, unfortunately, like people who claim to be mental health influencers or advocates, but in actual fact, they're just either, you know, propagating kind of misogynistic talking points or men's rights activism. And we have less regulation here in the Australian kind of legal compliance regulatory component. And so I think that's what makes it sort of different to the UK and the US. And also, I think one of the things that's quite worrying is that the stakes in Australia are real. You know, Australia has, in the developed world, you know, a pretty high rate of domestic abuse and violence. And I think one of the things there is that it can be a bit confronting for a lot of Australian men to grapple with, because often they'll look at other parts of the world where women may have fewer rights and they go, oh, it's a problem over there, it happens over there, or people of colour do it, it's not what we do here, it's not our culture. But unfortunately, it's normalised enough here, right? It's normalised enough here that there is, like, you know, a government national plan to reduce violence against women. It's not doing well, but that's because it's not just the role of government. It's the role of everybody, not just institutions, to actually be accountable and responsible for this. So I think Australia fits in globally in the sense that, yeah, we're a small population, but that doesn't mean that we have an excuse to continue any of this kind of behaviour.
So I wanted to round off this episode by exploring how the rise of the manosphere and alpha male culture and everything we just talked about has impacted impacted dating, particularly for Gen Z? I know we touched about it a little bit at the top of the episode, but how does the manosphere shape what young men believe women should want in a partner? And how do you think that this is influencing how young people are approaching dating?
Yeah, I think this whole manosphere thing is really shifting the kind of way that men approach dating, the way that they view women, whether or not they are dating. And I think one of the things that is happening is that it's kind of training men to accept submission from women. It's training men that they are superior and dominant and that women are inferior second-class beings. And that's not true. There is no biological basis for that. There is no scientific basis for that. There is only a cultural one that's being normalized. And I think that it's training men to expect submission from women rather than shared values. You know, and it might seem like some of these trends are just a little bit of fun, right? But in actual fact, they're kind of speaking to this kind of shifting value system where there are men who view women negatively. And I think that's really, really worrying. And like 93% of, Bumble users want an alignment in values, right? So the tide is turning. They want to see that their prospective like romantic partners share some of the same core values and moral beliefs. And one of those is gender equality, the idea that women and men and transgender folk, that everyone is an equal human being deserving of dignity and safety and respect. And that kind of gap between what men expect and what women want is becoming clearer, but it's also fixable.
So if men are consuming the type of content that we were speaking about earlier, like pickup artist content and the like, how can they tell when it's crossed into something more toxic? And how would you say that they can, I guess, mediate that?
I think, one of the things there is that we have to kind of, if you're a man who sees this content, kind of think about what are the expectations of women and men that are being put out through this content. Is it expecting that, or is it framing things that like women are out to manipulate them? In which case, that's a red flag, right? Don't engage with that kind of content, right? Is it the kind of content that's making it seem like women have to play therapist, right? Or is it creating an environment where there's fear, where there should be, curiosity? Right? We want to be able to encourage men to be able to identify what is actually helping and what is potentially harming. And I guess at its core, the most foundational thing is that if you are a man who comes across content and you're not sure if it's the kind of content that is manosphere, red pill stuff, right? Ask yourself one question. Ask, who is it saying is responsible for this? Is it blaming women and girls? Is it blaming others? Then maybe it's not the answer. If it frames women as the enemy, then potentially it's toxic. If it encourages manipulation or blame, then potentially it's toxic. So ask yourself this, is this helping me to grow and be better? Or is this making me more angry? Is this making me feel like women are to blame and that the only way forward is for a return to some weird utopia where men had all the rights? And it's kind of that critical self-reflection and that critical engagement is so, so important, and I don't blame people from Gen Z in particular, right? Because never before, like Lauren, you'll know this as a millennial, we occupied a world before we were inundated with all this stuff. Yeah. Right? We old.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
I feel so old.
But that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, I know.
Right? It's now where like a world where you won't even know how much stuff you actually are consuming because it's everywhere, right? We're bombarded with messages. And that makes it really, really hard. That makes it really difficult. And so I think one of the things for everyone, but especially boys and men, is to ask, is this helping me grow or is this making me angry? Because if it is just there to make you angry and blame shift, then you're not going to grow from that. You're not actually going to become better. Your dating prospects won't improve. Your romantic life won't improve. You probably won't end up getting jacked anyway, right? No matter how much you go to the gym. It's bad for your health. Yeah. Right? So all of this stuff, right, whether you care about women or not, and I'd encourage you to definitely care about women, is going to have negative like health impacts for you as a guy. So it's like a lose-lose.
Okay, so then how can we encourage young men to take one step further and actively work against misogyny? So let's say they've identified the content. They're like, this is making me angry. I can tell this is red-pilled content. How then do we get them to care about misogyny?
It's a really good question, and I think that what we can do to help men counter misogyny, particularly online, is to think about the kind of content that they engage with. So follow better role models, right? Actually engage with the men who are putting content out there that does address these issues, but in a way that doesn't blame women or other groups, right? Speaking up in group chats, even with humor, right? Not laughing along at those jokes, right? Particularly, when you meet someone new and you're sharing experiences of your first date or something. If someone makes a sexist comment or a joke about someone that they've just met or that they're about to go on a date with, don't laugh along at those kinds of sexist jokes, right? Actually create an environment that is not like a safe space, but a brave place, right? A brave place to actually stand up against sexism or misogyny. And then I think ultimately understanding that your social media is yours alone, right? Your feed, right? Whether it's on TikTok, it's your For You page, or it's your Discover page on other apps, it's actually able to be curated according to what you believe, right? You can shape it according to whatever you want, right? And so actually be a bit more intentional with what you consume online. And I think for a lot of men in particular, they won't necessarily realize that they've been, drawn into this kind of red pill dark side of the internet and the manosphere because it starts so innocently. Right? And I think being more intentional with how you consume and engage with social media is a really, really powerful way, not only to counter misogyny online, but actually to have a better experience. Governments, for example, have proposed things like a social media ban and all that kind of thing. And I just think that stuff is so ridiculous, right? I remember being young, and if my parents were like, don't do something, or the government was like, you can't do this, I'd be like, I'm definitely doing that. That is 100% the only thing I want to do now. And so I don't think this will work. I think this is a real kind of policy failing as an idea. And I think we, I can't say we because I don't really fit under the young people umbrella anymore, but but I think that young people have the answer, and it's being intentional in the content that they consume, and I love seeing when, particularly young men will, they'll pull out their phone and they'll be like, hey, this is the stuff that I'm looking at. What do you think? And it's kind of like it's footballers or sports people who are a bit more open about their social values or, for example, athletes that have stood up for the Black Lives Matter movement, and actually shared resources. And I think that stuff is really, really powerful, and seeing particularly sports people and seeing, kind of traditional kind of quote unquote alpha male types share this stuff is so good because it's not just the kind of soy boys or whatever. It's now getting to the kind of the parts of mainstream culture where quote unquote normal men, right? Or men who look like men are actually taking a stand. And I think it's really, really powerful. So follow those role models. Actively reject the types of ones who are just saying stuff that you don't believe in, and hold yourself and your friends to account. And really, what you consume shapes what you believe, right? And if you genuinely make a conscious choice to actively just get rid of that stuff, firstly, the algorithm will learn from it and it won't show it to you. But you'll also end up finding another corner of the internet which has great examples of masculinity that will do a lot more for you. Shame doesn't change behavior, but belonging does. It is when men are in a place of maybe despair or despondency or loneliness or isolation, when they are at their most vulnerable, that these types of red pill content creators are actually using that as an opportunity to line their own pockets, right? To get rich off them. I think that when we give men that sense of purpose and empathy, they're able to choose better, they're able to make better decisions. And one of the most beautiful things there is that not only do they benefit, but the women in their lives actually, comment on it and they're like, he's so much better to be around. He's,
Totally.
he's actually looking after himself, etc. And I think it's really, really powerful. And so for me, a lot of this actually speaks to the possibilities that this has for men rather than what's being taken away.
I love that. All right. So to round off this ginormous episode with your role as Bumble's safety advocate, what initiatives do you think could be implemented on dating platforms to promote healthier, more respectful interactions that could counter those toxic behaviors emerging from spaces like the Manosphere?
Yeah, I think, I have to say, and hats off to Bumble for this, because they've sort of understood that technology has the possibility to help, right? They've actually understood that as an app that prioritizes women's empowerment and women leading the way and going first, that they can use that technology and harness it for good. So features like ID verification, right? That you can go on the app and I've done it. It takes 2 seconds. Literally, you use your government issued ID and you verify yourself, and then it shows people that are prospective matches that you're legit, that you are who you say you are. It leads to better matches, right? I think that's amazing. The idea that you can review before you send, I think that's really powerful, right? I know that we all kind of sometimes want someone to sense check our messages. They want us to read before we send something and go, is that flirty? Is that banter? Or is that crossing the line into something that's negging, right? And for a lot of guys in particular who've been force-fed and shoved down their throats all this negative messaging about how you pick up women or how you meet women and how you kind of can have more matches, that review before you send is a really powerful way to go, hey, are you sure? Like, that isn't, are you sure that you want to send that? So I think what's really powerful about the way it works as well, having been able to demo it, is see that it doesn't say to you outright, like, you can't say this, right? It doesn't say that's bad. Instead, it gives you an opportunity to be self-reflective. And I think that's one of the most powerful things, is Bumble understanding that giving men the opportunity to actually do what they know is right is so much more powerful than just telling people this is what's right and this is the way that you have to be. And so I think Bumble is doing an amazing job there, particularly in light of the fact that 95% of users want dating apps to stop harm before it starts, right? They want them to prevent it. And so I guess this is, Bumble's moment to lead, and they're doing that. And I'm really proud to be partnering with Bumble as a safety advocate for that. But then also I think understanding that it's not just about the app, right? It's not just on Bumble. It's actually on all people, all users of the app, especially men, to understand that this is cultural. And when I say it's cultural, I don't mean that it's like I'm South Asian, Indian background. I don't mean like it's, if you're Indian or you're African or you're Dominican or whatever. It's not like that. It means cultural in terms of the society that we live in, right? It means culture in terms of society. And Bumble is creating this space for new conversations, for better conversations. It's creating this space for men to be engaged in conversations that prioritize safety and empowerment when it comes to dating. And I think that's where that kind of intersection is. That dating apps like Bumble are doing an amazing job with these new features, but ultimately we have to encourage, and I really want to see more men using these features, because I think ultimately then it's going to create a safer experience for women. Right? Because if you're a guy who feels alarmed or shocked or scared when you hear the statistics about the kinds of experiences that women have, instead of just going, well, I'm not one of those guys, because I don't do that. I'd never spike a woman's drink, or I'd never cross the boundaries of consent, or I'd never, a no means no. It's not enough anymore, right? It's not enough to just go, well, I'm one of the good guys, because that's the bare minimum, right? That's the ground floor. And so this is really an opportunity, I think, for men to be part of the conversation. And so I'm proud that Bumble has led that, using their tech to actually make things better. But actually now it's kind of almost an invitation for men in Australia to go, okay, what kind of man do I want to be?
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Where can people find you?
I'm on all the socials. Just type my name in at, Tarang Chawla. I'm there. Get in touch if anything that's come up in here, you've got questions about it. I check my DMs. It'd be lovely to hear from you. And stay safe.
Infinite Scroll is a podcast produced, presented, and co-written by me, Lauren Meisner, for Centennial World. This episode was researched and co-written by Annabelle Ben-David. Thank you so much for listening. I love you guys, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.